Anyway, welcome everybody. This is Planet Mitch. I'm Planet Mitch from planet5d.com. And with me today I have DJ from DSLR Film Noob.
Hello, I'm DJ from DSLRFilmNoob.com. And that's all I've got.
DJ and I do a podcast every week on Fridays. DJ also has another gentleman, Dustin, and I can remember Dustin, not Dustin. See, it's already started, DJ. Devin, I don't know what Devin's last name.
Devin is a great guy. He's on the cast. He works for Fox as a studio engineer. Just transferred actually to LA. That's why you haven't seen him on the podcast for a couple weeks. He's in the process of moving right now, but really great guy.
So DJ also is, what do you call yourself? A director, producer, filmmaker?
Yeah, I do feature-length films. I do a lot of commercial stuff. My specialty at my regular job is actually safety videos and educational information for new safety equipment. So if you are really interested in processes and performing different tasks at a company, they're really fun procedurals that I film all the time. Wonderful.
Yawn.
Yeah. The horror movies are way more fun.
Yeah. Blood and guts. We love it. So we have a lot of fun on the DSLR Film Noob podcast. If you want to check that out, search on the web for DSLR Film Noob. The other gentleman that we're going to have on the show today is a good friend of mine. DJ is a good friend of mine, too. I missed that part of the introduction. But Barry Andersson is the author of this wonderful book called The DSLR Filmmaker's Handbook. He's a filmmaker, director. He and I co-produced a short when the 5D Mark III came out. We were the first to come out with a short when the 5D Mark III came out. And no, we're not going to do it for the 5D Mark IV. We learned our lesson. But welcome, Barry. Glad to have you here. And he's frozen.
Uh-oh. Lost him. I wondered, he was very dapper and very straight-faced. I couldn't tell.
It paused, so I have no idea what sort of jokes were made at my expense or what was said. But I guess
I just introduced you.
Okay. Well, thank you. I'm Barry, and Mitch, I need to get you a copy of version 2 of the book. Remind me about that when we're done.
Yes, I definitely have to have the new version. It's insanely good. If you're looking for a book on DSLR filmmaking, that's the one to have. I've seen all the other ones. Don't bother. All right, so everybody knows that there's
talk about what we're here for. Let's give them some good stuff, shall we?
Yeah. Well, so we're here to talk about this camera right here, the 5D Mark IV. See, I blew it. I didn't cover up the right thing. Okay. 5D Mark IV was just announced this morning from Canon, and what we're going to do is we're going to go through a lot of the specs and talk about filmmaking and photography with the 5D Mark IV. Those of you who are watching live, thank you for being here. There is a question and answer panel. If you want to ask a question, go ahead and start shoving those in there. We will be monitoring the chat room for questions, and we will get to those as we go. I'm going to start out with a poll, just a quick, fun poll, because DJ and I don't get to do polls when we do our podcast. So I'm going to try this out, see how this works. Starting a poll, what are your thoughts on the 5D Mark IV? It's amazing. Meh. It's boring. I've moved to Nikon, Sony, or Panasonic. I'd love to know, for those of you who are online, what your thoughts are on that. My thoughts, real quickly, are I'm very excited. I've pre-ordered one from my local camera shop called Schiller's Camera here in St. Louis. For those of you who have access to a local camera store, it's kind of cool if you go and order from them. Of course, if you order from a website like B&H or Amazon, DJ and I both have Amazon and B&H links, so we would appreciate it if you would click through from those, and I'll post one of those coming up. So far, it looks like most people are thinking it's boring or meh. So Real quick, DJ, what do you think? What's your quick thoughts? And then we'll get into some of the other good details.
So before I even read any of the specs, when I heard 4K, I immediately pre-ordered. I jumped on the bandwagon and I'm in. But then I started looking and I was like, oh, seriously? A 1.74 crop factor? At that point, you know, my love for the 5D Mark III has always been full frame. And when I find out that that is not the case, I may as well stick with my two competitors, which are the A7S Mark II and the GH4, which I continue to shoot on to this day. I'm on the fence about canceling because I'm not a photographer, so it doesn't bring a lot of love to me.
So, Mike, I got a question for you then, because I'll be the antagonizing one today, so everyone can hate me. If you are bothered that you don't have the full frame sensor and you're bothered by the 1.74 crop, then why do you claim that you love the GH4? Because that's worse in terms of the crop size.
The GH4 is one of the easiest cameras to use and a backup mostly for me. And it has lenses that are available all the way down to 7 millimeters, which provides a 14 millimeter field of view. So the wide is the part that makes me sad, and the depth of field is the part that I lean on my A7S Mark II for. That's the only reason I've kept both of the cameras. Otherwise, if I didn't care about the shallow depth of field, the GH4 would. I just have two of these, and they're half the price or a quarter the price of a. What isn't the price $34.99?
Yeah, it's basically $3,500.
Yeah, and I think the GH4 is down to like $800. Am I right? $900. So you could get 3 of these for the price of a 5D Mark IV.
You're now asking me to do math. I didn't know that was part of the deal to be on this show.
Got me.
So I'm gonna jump out if that's gonna be the case.
Nice.
No, the reason I ask is I always find when people have these discussions back and forth on cameras, they'll say something and then they'll say something else that doesn't seem to be congruent. So if you're C camera and it's not your primary camera, then I think, yeah, having a cheaper camera that you can do those, needing wide angle, believe me, I don't even like working with Super 35 chips because, you know, you're always fighting to get something that's wide enough and where you're shooting. So I understand that. So that's at least there's methodology to your madness. Which
now
is
I got a question for you. As far as crop factor goes, how do you feel about the A6300 from Sony versus the 5D Mark IV? It's a $1,000 camera. You don't have the headphone jack, which is kind of frustrating, but you do have a mic input, and it's $998, so $1,000 a pop for a little bit better field of view and less crop factor.
How much time do we have on this show? I co-own an F55. I shoot with the FS7, F5, F55, the A7S2, AR2, A7S, and I would say that's probably now approaching 50% of my workflow, and the other part is all Canon. I believe that Sony comes out with great products, and what they do is they give us great products that do things that either annoy my clients or make me basically constantly doubt that I'm going to get a good end product, because there's so many things you can do that I don't find them very easy, and it's very easy to either mess up yourself, or if you're working with a team, if you give a camera to someone, it's very easy that they can mess something up that you're buried later. So I love Sony equally as much as I hate them. It's like a politician. I want to vote for them, but I can't stand them. And it's kind of the same thing a lot with Sony. Sony hasn't come out with products that you love using, you just love the capabilities of. Yeah. Canon still makes products I like using, but I'm frustrated at the, what I'm getting for that product. And I think there seems to me, in my opinion, there seems to be 3 categories. You have people that are looking for the cheapest possible camera that needs to do a feature set, and I'll be a little bit derogatory, quality isn't of the utmost importance. Then you have people who basically need to turn around stuff really fast for a client who is asking for things to look good but not perfect or great. And then you have the snobs that want everything perfect and great, have a little bit more budget, or are willing to take on post workflow in order to put their mind at ease to give a better client. I feel like those are 3 different groups, and cameras fall in different ones. That last one, I know people who will shoot either on Red or Sony, and they'll go through into all the conversions and kick out ProRes and stuff for people, even though they're not getting paid for it, just because they want to shoot on something that works. and I find that the largest segment of the people out there, most of them basically just need to be able to create great footage and get it out the door quick, which is why Canon has done so well, even though people complain every time they come out with a new camera that they've left the game, they're not part of the game, and I don't believe that.
Well, as someone who complains, I still end up buying them, so
well, people complain about everything, so
exactly.
I mean,
it is the world of the internet, and it's very common to only see the people who complain, because the people who are getting out and doing the work are just keeping their mouths shut.
No, they're cashing checks,
right.
So they order stuff and they cash checks.
Right.
So I'll tell you my thing. I owned 2 Canon 5D Mark IIs, loved them. When Mitch and I did our movie, I had to buy a 5D Mark III. And I didn't want to spend the extra $1,000, and at the time I was very underwhelmed by the feature set, and so I shelled out the $3,500 so we'd have a second body on our shoot in case there was a failure. And I've made more money off the 5D Mark III than I have any other camera or piece of equipment I've ever owned in my life, so it was by far one of the best things I've ever ordered. And recently I ordered the 1DX Mark II, and I decided that over the Sonys because I needed to have a 4K capable DSLR, but I wanted one that shot at 60 frames. And that was the first one that shot 4K at 60 frames. And I remember at the time going, wow, do I really want to spend this much money on it? And since I purchased it, it's been an A camera or B camera on almost every shoot. And it looks to be well on its way to paying for itself. So what I was curious about and seeing when bought that months ago, I knew the 5D Mark IV was coming out, and I knew there was no way they weren't going to have 4K, but I didn't know what they'd do with the slow-mo. And to me, that was going to be the big factor as to whether or not I would have sold this and potentially got 1 or 2 5D Mark IVs, and that to me is the biggest. The thing that makes me the saddest about it is the fact that you can't do 60p in 4K.
I was afraid that was going to be one of the biggest complaints.
We've had a couple of. Go ahead.
No, that's fine. Go ahead.
No, I don't remember what I was going to say, so I'll just be quiet.
It's fascinating to me because I've been doing a lot of research today, and we're still going to try to go through some of the specs and talk about those individually. So we're rounding out some of those things already. But it's been fascinating to read a lot of the comments today because there are people that are just saying, and Wayne said it here in the chat room, I have a 5D Mark III, so I don't need a 5D Mark IV. The specs don't impress me. But I've spoken to several people today that have used the 5D Mark IV, including Bruce Dorn, whom, by the way, we're going to have on a live webinar next week, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Canon Explorer of Light, and he just says the image quality. Vincent LaFerre, by the way, has been using one. Haven't chatted with him, but he posted this morning that this is the most amazing camera, all-around camera. Now he caveats that, saying, the video isn't what he would totally love, but Canon's chosen to make this a photography and video camera. So the thing that's fascinating to me so far is the people that have used it are just raving about it. So we got to get our hands on it. We're going to talk about specs and pluses and minuses and all that kind of stuff here. But I just wanted to throw that out there that people that have used it that I've talked to today just think the image quality is phenomenal. So
now I got a question for both of you
ahead.
guys before we get going.
Right.
Now that the 5D Mark IV is out, the 1DC has dropped in price by several $1,000s, and it provides a little bit better crop factor. About what is it, 1.2 I think? So would that be a 1.3? So would that be a better choice feature-wise and a little bit more video-oriented if you're a filmmaker?
What was the new price on the 1DC?
I'm seeing it right now sitting at about $4,000 on eBay, and I've been hovering over it for a couple hours thinking about buying it.
Is that a new or used one?
Used market.
Okay.
Hey, Barry, and for all of those who are watching that don't know DJ, he is the king of eBay. This man knows
I'm a
more about the
cheapskate.
used prices on lenses and cameras than anybody I ever saw. So, trust me, he knows his pricing. Go ahead, Barry.
I don't know how to live up to that now. I just feel like I overspend on everything, and I feel shameful. So thank you for that. I think the 1DC and the 1DX Mark II are pretty compelling. I think the reason I wouldn't go with the 1DC, I don't think that has 60p, does it? I don't think so.
No, it's a 30p is all.
Yeah. And so I think that versus I think that could be a viable option. I'd actually have to see some of the footage coming off the 1D or the new Mark IV before I would make that decision. But they're basically in the same ballpark in terms of price. I'm always a little bit hesitant to take a product that's that old and basically say, hey, this is my new camera, because I've noticed, I'd say probably 70-80% of my clients, they don't care about what camera I'm using. But at the same rate, I do believe that it is very important to, when you're out there doing stuff, staying current. So in my opinion, the 5D Mark IV, I guess let me just I'll follow up with what Mitch said. My opinion of the 5D Mark IV is, as much as I've heard the disaster, that's the end of Canon. Canon's left the market. They don't care. Blah blah blah. I don't believe that at all. I believe there's a huge market that got started their careers in DSLR, and now as they move up in their career, they want to go to the Sonys, the Reds, stuff like that. And they basically look back at the start of their careers at DSLR, and so they want to naturally put it down and talk about real stuff because now they've become higher. And I still think the majority of the content being created, these cameras are perfect for them. And so I feel Canon said we could either compete at the top end, bottom end, but they have all the different divisions. So they made this camera to be something that basically someone like myself, I'm not a photographer, but I get more and more jobs where I have to take stills as well. So having a good stills camera is now a critical tool for me. And I don't want to carry 87 things out. I don't want to have 3 different lens sets that go on different cameras. I want something that just works. I think Canon just basically said, you know what, we are going to be we can do a little bit of everything, but master of none. That is the tagline for the 5D Mark IV. And I think for probably 85-90% of the market, I think it's the perfect camera if they're ready for the upgrade. I see a few people that are posting here that there's no need for them to upgrade. And I always say, if you're making money on your stuff and you're not getting the demand for what it is supposed to do, like if you don't need 4K and the 5D3, I bet you I'll still be using my 5D3 for another year or two before I don't use it anymore. So I'm not getting rid of that camera in the near term. But I think Canon, did they hit it out of the ballpark? Nope. Did they stub their toe? Nope. They came out with a camera that seems to make perfect sense for me, that I think is exactly what most of the market needs. A very versatile tool that mostly does everything it needs for a price point that the most amount of people can afford to buy. And I think that's what they delivered.
Yeah, very, very true. And I think the original concept of the 5D Mark II was that they were aiming it at the press photographer who needed to go out and shoot video, and he needed to do both things. So I think they're still in that mode, and they say, like you said, the other cameras they have that are higher priced or dedicated video cameras fill the needs for those people that need that kind of equipment. Or they just go over to Sony and live with the trouble that Sony has. Let's get into some fun specs, if you don't mind. There are a couple of things that just really kind of surprised me, and that's I don't know why they didn't provide some more functionality, but let's go through that. For example, the 4K that's on here is DCI 4K, which is the full resolution, and I didn't write down the numbers because I can never remember all those numbers. But that's the full. Thank you, 4096. But they didn't give an option to put out UHD 4K, which is the slightly smaller 4 sizes that the vast majority of people seem to want to shoot. Why wouldn't they provide us with both? Why don't they just give us a... You got a clue?
I'm not a software engineer, but my guess is a lot of the people that drive the usage of DSLRs are people that are trying to make more cinematic images, which would be your true DCI and not your UHD, and you're not losing that many pixels that for most people, just scaling it the X% to get rid of it, it's not going to change their I just don't think it's going to matter that much. So I think they just said, you know what, it's easier for people to scale down and instead of putting crops along the top and not affect your framing, and I think they just said it's easier, and that's what we're putting out.
Well, it also sounds nicer, too. If you go to UHD as opposed to DCI, you would have to up that crop factor just a little bit more since they're doing pixel for pixel. So as a spec junkie, you look through and you're like, oh, yeah, 1.73 isn't too bad. But then if you're actually going to UHD, you're going to lose a little bit of that. So now it's more like 1.75-ish, or 1.76. So maybe that was part of the deal, and it's not very hard as far as programming goes if they're just pixel mapping straight to 4K to give you that extra little bit of resolution and say, DCI, here you go, guys. We gave you some extra stuff. Congratulations.
Isn't it easier to go down in post than it would be to go up?
Yeah, you'd have to upscale.
Yeah.
And the aspect ratio is slightly different too. I don't remember what the numbers are off the top of my head, but you'd have to crop as opposed to just stretch.
So we finally got 422 color space, and people aren't jumping up and down about that. Why not?
Motion JPEG? Anyone?
Well. So that's the key to you, is that it's motion JPEG? 422?
Yeah, 128 gigs of memory space on a card will get you like 25 minutes or so in motion JPEG at 422, which, granted, that gives you a lot more to work with if you're color grading. But at the same time, I'm kind of in the category that you mentioned earlier about cheap and dirty resolution. Like for me, a lot of times I will hit a color in my camera and just shoot, and people don't even care. I'm turning around pictures of machines working and of people pushing buttons. So that doesn't really help me, and to not have a 4K option that is in a more compressed format is sort of frustrating for me in the work that I do. So.
Jeff just popped in and asked, how is the 5D Mark IV for landscape and studio work models, etc.? By the way, and Barry kind of responded to that. But Jeff, I would like you to tune in Monday at 1 o'clock Eastern when I'm going to have Bruce Dorn, and I was going to talk about this a little later. But Bruce Dorn is a Canon Explorer of Light, and one of the videos that Canon posted on their 5D Mark IV site this morning is a video that Bruce Dorn and his team shot out in Arizona, and it has models and landscapes in it. So get a chance to tune in Monday at 1 o'clock. I will post the URL for the sign up for that webinar, but he should be able to answer that question really well. And Bruce, as I told you, we were chatting this morning, he really loves this camera. So in terms of specs, this is a 500 megabits per second bit rate, and yes, it's motion JPEG. It was a big deal when Magic Lantern hacked the 5D Mark III to be able to do variable bit rates. Does anybody really care what the bit rate is as long as it's more than 60 or 100 megabits per second?
Well, it matters when you're shooting 4K because of the fact that it's not apples to apples. Your bit rate on something that's a quarter of the size, when you blow it up, people are like, oh, it's 500 versus 60. Well, it's not, because if you take the same area, it's not an apples to apples comparison. So I think it matters, but I think the big question, I think kind of the elephant in the room that oftentimes when I'm training or talking to people, and even sometimes my clients, is people are like, it doesn't do X. But my question is how often do you need to do X? For instance, people talk about, hey, I want 10-bit color, 12-bit color, 16-bit color. I want, megabit rate over XYZ, and then you talk to them about what they're doing, and they're like, oh yeah, I just burn it in camera and hand it off to my client. You're like, well, then you're not taking advantage of any of the things that you're complaining the camera doesn't do, and therefore it's not really that important. So I've asked people before, everyone's like, oh, I want a color grade, and I'm just going to state right now that color grading is an art form. If what you're saying is color grading is saying I'm going to boost the saturation, I'm going to touch up the contrast, and I'm going to do one little thing, that's not color grading, and you don't need 16-bit color to do those things. This 8-bit crappy color, most should be exposed well, will be just fine. So yes, if you're going in and doing some sort of a high-end Tim Burton color treatment to everything you're doing, absolutely you're going to need that. For most people, it's not necessary. It's nice, but not necessary. And I'm all about how do you make money off of what you buy, and so I'm always figuring out what works in the real world. And I think for a lot of people, the 5D Mark IV could be a great camera. I don't think it's for everybody.
People are always shocked when I tell them, what are you shooting in there? How are you grading? I'm like, well, honestly, guys, I'm lazy, and I set my camera to vivid and make sure I expose correctly, and everybody seems to be extremely happy with my work. So in many cases, especially in the production market where you're just trying to crank out stuff really fast, you don't even have time to have a color grader work on your footage. And I personally don't have time to sit there and go through all my footage. So you're absolutely right, Barry. That's something I hear from a lot of people. And then it's like, do you actually do that? Do you have time to do that? And they don't. Yeah, exactly.
So let's go back to the specs. But I think if people have specific questions about what they want to know, feel free to put them in because we can address individual ones. We'll go through the specs. But I really think I read, and I'll state this as well, early reports that I had read, basically this was the worst camera ever to be released on humankind. I'm like, wow, that's pretty bad. Then I read, Vincent and Bruce's stuff, and they're like, this is maybe the greatest camera ever made. And I go, okay, well, these people that I'm reading first off aren't really Canon fans to begin with, so they're going to be more negative. And then obviously Canon Explorer of Lights, well, they're kind of in Canon's back pocket, so I'm going to take what they say with a grain of salt, and it lies somewhere in between. But like I said, I legitimately, my opinion is that they made a great all-around camera that's probably slightly overpriced for what it is feature set-wise, but for 85% of the market, this is just a workhorse, printing money sort of camera that just works.
And that actually sort of answers Jeff's question, because he asked, can each of you say who you think the Mark IV is designed for? And I'll start by saying, I'll go back to what I said before. I think Canon really has in mind the press photographer / videographer that needs to do both jobs. This is a multi-purpose stills camera that shoots video. It's an incredible stills camera. I'm looking forward to really getting my hands on it and seeing how well it really works. But this is not a replacement for the Sony A7S Mark II. They don't care about that market. If you go back and look at the statistics, Sony's just a little gnat in terms of Canon's market share. They're smart. They've determined who to market this camera to. And like Barry said, I think 85% of the market is going to be sucking this camera down like crazy because they don't need the 8-bit or the 12 bits and the 16 bits and all that other stuff, and they wouldn't know how to use it half the time anyway. They need to be like Deejay and put out video that looks really nice, and this camera is going to be great for that. I
will state this because Sony and Panasonic keep coming up in the thread, and Panasonic to me, if you are not using heavy filtration, it always looks like video to me. I do not like the look without that, and most people are too lazy to buy and understand filtration, so that's a harder sell for me. Sony, yes, they give you the log and they give you much more flexibility in post, but even when you go through that, I find it very difficult to get skin tones to look the way that I want, where I think Canon's secret sauce is the fact that skin tones off their cameras come out pretty damn close to being perfect. And so you can put up with a lot more because people just pay attention to skin tones, and that makes all the difference in the world. And I think that's the reason that if everything else was equal, if Sony gave you that exact same skin tone, I think Canon would be in a huge world of trouble. But that's currently not the case, and that's why they still have... I mean, I have clients now where I'll say, hey, I got the Sony cameras and stuff. Like, you know what? We know the Canon workflow. We just like how they look. We want one of those cameras. And so that matters. So even if you don't love it, if your clients have a say, make sure to ask them what they're willing to hire you at, because the last thing you want to do is try to get the job and then try to convince them to use a camera that they don't want to use. You're not going to make a lot of work that way.
Well, and you're absolutely right. That's why I still have a Canon camera in my collection, and I also have my GH4 and my A7S Mark II. They're not the same cameras, and for some reason when I shoot on a Canon camera, no matter what, like it always turns out, without very much work on my part. It turns out looking very nice, and I don't have to do a lot of work in post. With the GH4, I generally have to tweak stuff and mess around with it just a little bit to get it to look a little bit better. Unless I'm just delivering stuff fast, then it doesn't matter. The A7S, it always ends up a little bit blue. Like no matter what I do, it's always a little tinted, and I don't know what it is about Sony. This camera does not replace the 5D Mark IV that is coming out. If you're a still shooter, 30 megapixels is way better than the See in the Dark 12 megapixels that you get out of the A7S Mark II. So the two cameras, you buy one for video, I would say, and you buy the other one for a hybrid option. Does that sound fair to you guys?
Yes, absolutely. Patrick, I don't know, Barry, you still there? Yeah, you're moving.
Yeah.
All right. Patrick asked a great question, and I hadn't really thought about diving into this, but Patrick wants to know, do we think there's a chance for Magic Lantern to hack this camera?
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, the obvious answer was that Canon specifically told the team not to go after the 1DX or the 1DC, but I haven't heard anything about Canon forbidding them going after this one, so I think it's probably a yes from me.
I think it's likely they will unless they have a new edict. But I think how they've structured their points, I don't. If they allowed them to touch the 5D Mark III, I'd assume that they would just continue to allow that to happen.
Well, Canon could easily stop them from screwing around with the 5D Mark IV if they wanted to. They don't lock the code when they release a firmware update for the 5D Mark III, and Mark IV, if they don't do that, then they're basically saying, free reign, guys, come on in and mess around with this. They still will have to wait for the first firmware update to the camera, though, before they can really dig in their heels.
Really?
Then I guess that's the hope that early on they come up with a an update. Sooner the update comes.
It changed. They misspelled something in the menu by accident, or dinked up one of the foreign languages.
Gee, that'll never happen. One of the first things I'm going to test, by the way, when I get this camera from Schiller's Camera Plug, is whether it has the black sun problem.
I am so sick and tired of this coming up as some major catastrophe, because I want to know, outside of if you're making a film, how often do you point the camera at the sun for a shot that's paying you money? Because I think I've maybe done it twice in my career.
It's interesting, Barry, because Deejay and I actually talked about this once on his podcast. I've actually seen on 2 TV shows examples where they were shooting with probably a black magic camera or something, where the sun was actually in the background, and I saw the black sun problem, and guess what? There was not a huge uproar that, oh my God, the Earth is falling out of the sky because the black sun was on that TV show. Nobody noticed it.
That's also
I did notice.
That's narrative work. I'm saying, like, corporate people, when you go, like, let's do B-roll of the factory and talk to the president or the marketing manager.
Exactly.
They're not like, hey, and then throw in a shot of the sun for me, please. It doesn't happen.
Yeah. One thing that I found very interesting that has not been talked about much is that this camera actually does HDR video, which was one of the things that Magic Lantern hacked for the 5D. I think it was the Mark III. I posted on the Planet 5D blog at the top a sample that Canon released, and they didn't tout it a whole lot, but it showed without HDR and an HDR video sample, and I thought it was pretty impressive, which gets us into the dynamic range question. Most of the people, Bruce Dorn, there was a B&H panel this morning. The guys that were on the B&H panel, that's where I was coming up with this, talked about the dynamic range, and they said that their experience was that the blacks were easier to bring out the shadows and the highlights that are in the shadows. Slight improvement in dynamic range, but nothing phenomenal. Would you guys use HDR video, or did you see the samples?
I did not look at the samples. I think there is a use for it, but I'm not sure if it's broad enough use that would be something that would be a thing that I would think I can make money to justify upgrading the camera.
It's not on my radar at all.
That wouldn't be your only reason to buy the camera? Why, if we're constantly talking about, man, we want more dynamic range, why wouldn't HDR video be on your radar, DJ?
It's something that everybody asks for, but then in reality, what do you do? The first thing, if you see high dynamic range footage, you're like, oh man, I need to crank up the contrast on this and crush the blacks a little bit and make it look a little more moody. And you immediately get rid of that HDR almost. And I've seen it happen multiple times where it's like, oh yeah, we got this great HDR footage, let's use it. And then, oh well, I don't really like that. I can see too much in the dark areas. Can you make that a little darker? And by the time you're done, you're not really. We wasted your time. And then you look at like what people are watching your stuff on, and for my feature-length films, when those are released, people are watching them on 5 to 7 year old flat screens that have maybe 6 stops of dynamic range. What's it matter? And in the future, will anybody notice? Maybe
No.
Somebody will want it, but I don't think so. I don't think there's enough demand for it. And I do the same thing. I'm like, oh yeah, give me as much dynamic range as possible. But when I'm practical about it, it's just me being silly, asking for something that I don't necessarily need.
I think that's.
I don't know if I agree with that. I think what I need to do when I get my hands on the camera, I'm going to test. I think there are situations where I'm stuck in like an office where I was shooting over in London. And we were in the, I don't know what you call it, the big convention center, and we shot like I think 30-some interviews all over the place. And there were rooms that we're in. We had the windows were blowing out like hell and dark on this side. I could see a high dynamic range video saving my blank many times over in certain situations, but I don't know if there's a loss of. I don't know how big the files are. I don't know if I'm sacrificing anything. I haven't played with it, so that's what I'm saying. As right now, it's not something I would upgrade to, but that would be the sort of thing that could push me over the top with the focus and the other things that make it amazing. It would be incredible.
Well, I think we definitely need much more dynamic range on your shot right now, Barry, because the front part of your face, the right side of your face, is very dark.
Sure. I'll rotate my
just
chair.
giving you crap.
I'm going to stare out the window now, and then you'll get better light on me. How about that?
Yeah. Oh, look at that! The dynamic range just
beautiful.
improved.
Well, thank you.
Wonderful.
I think I thought I was pretty good looking, but beautiful wasn't coming to mind, but I'll take it.
But that just goes to highlight, though, right? Isn't it still all about lighting? Don't you have to light your scenes correctly?
Yes.
So yes, we want more dynamic range, but in the vast majority of cases, like the sample that they showed Canon was a gentleman sitting in a car driving along the beach, and in the background you could actually see the water and the sky and that kind of stuff, and the gentleman inside the car was lit well enough that you could see him. And I'm thinking to myself, well, if I were going to shoot that, I would probably just put some lights on the guy so that it would be a little bit more balanced, as opposed to worrying about whether it was HDR video or not. But still, interesting thing that this camera does do, if people are interested in it. It's not been talked about much in any of the marketing, but it is there. So, question that was asked just a second ago, Mark said, does it not let you focus while recording? And the answer is yes, it does. This has dual pixel autofocus, which is on the 1DX Mark II, which is on the C300, 100, and all those kind of cameras. It's on the T4i.
I have the 1DX Mark II.
But yeah.
And Mitch has heard me in the past yell about autofocus and how.
Yes, I have.
Whatever. And I have to say that the autofocus touchscreen is life-changing.
Yes.
Like incredible. I've had jobs where I'm working by myself, and I basically just hit that little square, and if they lean forward and lean back, I'm looking at it later. I'm like, it's all in focus. I don't have to do anything. Woohoo! I mean, it's incredible what they've done there. The face tracking and stuff. It's pretty spot on. And I've heard rumors that this may be improved somehow above the 1D Mark.
Well, they've got touch position focusing, so you can actually rack focus from spot to spot, but I wasn't able to grasp the settings or controls for the speed of the rack focusing between focus points, which that would, I guess, be the linchpin as to whether it's useful or annoying in certain formats and shooting parameters.
I'm sure like anything, there are times you use it and times not, but for most people that autofocus touch while recording and at face tracking, it's phenomenal.
So just to clarify for those of you who are maybe a little confused, the dual pixel autofocus has multiple speeds on it, so that if you are, like DJ was just saying, you touch something in the background and then you touch something in the foreground, there is a speed at which the autofocus happens. The 1DX Mark II has 7 levels of that adjustment, and the 5D Mark IV has 10 levels of that.
Oh, wow.
So you can set very fine detail. I don't know the words. My words are stumbling here. But you certainly have the ability to adjust that. What?
It's like 10 speeds.
Right.
I mean, you can go like if you want.
Bike.
Yeah, if you want the car in the back to you and you want it instantaneously, you can do that. If you want it to be a slow rack where you're following, across like a field and you're seeing the flowers coming to something in the foreground, you can make it really milk it way out. So it's incredible.
I want to say, by the way, that I have the B&H video this afternoon, the panel that they did, and if you can go watch that, it's like an hour and a half. Pretty interesting. But they did specifically say, there was a Canon rep there, and he said that the dual pixel AF on the 5D Mark IV is better than any of the other cameras. So they have made improvements in the tracking ability of facial and other things on the 5D Mark IV. So they didn't specify a whole lot about it. I'm going to ignore the comment about Andrew from EOS HD because I read his post and I didn't think it was funny at all. But there are a lot of people that are complaining, and we talked about this before, of the 1.73 crop factor, 1.74, whatever the exact number is, I don't know. But I think if you really take it in your mind that you could have an APS-C kind of sensor, which is a 1.6 crop, or full frame, that cropping factor only applies to 4K. Now, what would have been really fun would be if that would be selectable, but I'm assuming that Canon has specifically set that up in order to not do the pixel binning that we all complain about with the... Which reminds me, by the way, one of the things I'm going to do when I get my 5D Mark IV
is send it to me to check out. Okay, that sounds good.
That's after I do these tests, Barry.
Okay.
What I'm going to do is I have a 5D Mark II, I have a 5D Mark III, and then I'll have a 5D Mark IV. I'm going to get the same lens for all 3 cameras, and I'm going to mount them on a rig, and I'm going to go do the wiggle tests and the jello tests and all that kind of stuff. And so we're going to have side-by-side of all 3 cameras just to see exactly what the differences are in terms of image quality, jello, moire, those kind of things. Moire hasn't been mentioned in any of the discussions so far that I've heard, so I just don't know whether it's improved or any different. The fact that this is a 30 megapixel sensor could have something to do with whether or not there's better moire or less.
Considering how moire almost disappeared on the 5D Mark III, the jump between 2 and 3, I would assume that moire is more or less a non-issue on this camera.
Yeah, that'd be my assertion as well. Canon's done a good job of at least listening to that respect and doing something about it. As far as Jello Cam goes, though, is that really... how many people actually have practical issues with that? There are occasions, and I will tell you, I was shooting a scene where our practical lighting was lightning in the background, and it ruined the shots, and I had to go cut it out and do it in post. But for the most part, shooting people, are you really flying your camera around so fast as to have that be a noticeable issue? Because it's not for me.
I have an answer for this, but I want to hear Barry's.
I decided that oh gosh, now I'm drawing a blank on his name. Doug Lyman that directed the Bourne series. Anyway, whoever directed the second and third Bourne, I decided to follow his career and just basically shake my camera at all times for no apparent reason. And Jello does become an issue. But since everyone's throwing up and not paying attention to what's happening anyway, they don't seem to really notice the Jello. So it's kind of like it doesn't matter even though it's there. So I'm somewhere in that range.
I have specifically watched movies and TV shows, and there are whip pans that happen quite often in many shows. I remember, and Deejay and I talked about this one time. There was a TV show that was set in the Amazon or something, and these guys were like doing a reality TV show, so they were filming everything that was happening on this boat. And I swear there were 10 whip pans an episode in that thing, and there were all kinds of diagonal lines as they did these whip pans. And again, it was all about the content. Nobody cared whether or not the lines as the camera whipped around had diagonals in them or not, what the angle was on the diagonals. It's just the only people that care about that are the filmmakers who think it's important, and the people watching the content don't give a rat's patooey.
If you have something compelling to show them, people will follow you through the weirdest technical issues. So again, I'm kind of done talking about those things because a lot of these cameras all have similar problems because they're all trying to do the same physics and the same engineering. So some are better on this camera than that. But to me, it's what is the feature set you need? Does this feature set match with what you want? And for what you're going to shell out money-wise, does that make sense versus buying something else? And I think someone could make the argument that going with the Sony camera is a better use of their money. And at the same rate, I wouldn't be at all surprised that there's an equal and compelling one saying upgrade to the Mark IV and just keep going. So I don't think there's necessarily a right answer there, but I do not think this is a disaster launch for them. And I also don't think it's the launch that's going to suddenly, help them grow their segment more. I think they're just going to keep things going, and it's going to be a good tool.
Now, I've got a question for both of you guys, and maybe you've done more research than me. I just noticed this dual pixel RAW thing. What the heck is that exactly? Do you guys know?
Yeah, it's like it's a Litro camera. So basically,
no, it's not. Time out.
Okay.
Time out. I'm not going to let you go there.
All right, go for it.
Because people have made the analogy to the Litro camera, and if you want to use that as an analogy, that's okay. So the Litro camera allows you to, in post-production, select a different focus point.
Wait,
which could
I'm
be
confused.
in the
You have an apple on your finger or something. What's happening here?
Stress
I have a
ball.
lot of,
Take that off.
it's
That's super distracting. I stopped listening to
it's
you.
actually a nose.
Don't do that. Just put that away. Just put it away and finish your statement.
So the Litro camera would let you, in post-production, select something in the background for a focus or way in the foreground and anything in between. This is nothing like that. It's basically like fine-tuning the focus. So if you just miss a hair off, like maybe you get the middle of the nose and you really wanted the focus to be on the eye, it's a really narrow kind of super sharpening micro focus if you want. It is nothing like the Litro, which would let you go way in focus. So, and there are three settings for this, and it's dual pixel RAW. So what they're doing is because every pixel on the sensor actually has 2 pixels to it, they're using that in post to be able to fine-tune the image. Now,
so what you're telling me is they finally created a solution for Sigma's lenses that are a little bit bad at focusing.
correct. And we have to see, the people again that I've seen talk about it say that it's like if you just happen to barely miss focus on the eyes in a wedding photo or something, you can zoom in. And if you look at the Canon videos, it's not very much of an adjustment. It's just a fine-tuning kind of thing. So it does three things. So the first one is the micro focus kind of adjustment. The second, and it may be good, by the way, if you happen to have a lens that you would normally do the micro adjustment so that, if it were slightly out of focus, maybe that fixes that problem so you don't have to do that. But the second thing it does is alter the bokeh in the background. So you could, if you want to enhance the bokeh a little bit, or bokeh, depending on how you want to say it.
Bokeh.
And there's a demo on the Canon site about that. And the third thing is flare reduction. So if there happens to be a lens flare, you can maybe get some of that flare out. It won't take it all out.
Oh, because you have a slightly different angle of incident for the light coming from the flare,
Right.
so you can move
Right.
from one pixel set to the other pixel set?
Basically, that's what they're doing internally, yes. Now, caveat, that can only be done in their DPP software. There is a question about whether things like Lightroom will be able to do that. If you turn that on, you get so the raw images out of this camera are about 30 megapixels, I think is what they're saying. If you turn that on, you will get 60 megapixel raw images out of it. So double the size in order to be able to have those adjustments. So you're not going to have it turned on all the time. And it's not effective in video whatsoever, so it's not even a conversation. It only applies to stills. They also highlight...
You just get it in focus, and then you don't have to worry about it. That's probably easier.
Well, there are some lenses that are more affordable than Canon lenses. The Sigma 85-1.4 Art comes to mind, that has notoriously been picky about micro focus adjustments in camera. And so if you don't have those settings set per camera, your focus points will always just be teensy-weensy bit off. And this, to me, like especially third-party lenses, would be great, because now I no longer have to go sit there and tweak with a focus chart to figure them out, and saves me a few $100s on lenses.
Yeah. So it's one of those things we're going to have to see how well it works. I think this is an interesting question from Craig. HDR videos, that's not the one. Oh, what happens to picture styles like City Style? I hadn't thought about this. So those are purchased products or free products. I wonder what happens to those. I don't know the answer to that question.
I don't think we're
Do you
going to
guys have an
know
idea?
until we get a chance to shoot with them and see what the wrapper looks like, what it's done in post, how it's processing it, and actually trying some different styles and see if the camera even elects you to do that, or if it just opts out of that. I would assume it's still applying something, so I would assume it would still work, but I don't know.
Well, one of the things that's a question for me is that there is still a low-pass filter in here, and a lot of the people are saying, the Sonys, they've gotten rid of the low-pass filter. And one of the knocks against Canon 5D Mark III footage is that it's a little soft, and you have to do sharpening in post. So it's going to be interesting. There is still a low-pass filter in this camera. I don't know whether maybe they've reduced its effectiveness. I asked one person and why they keep that in there, and he said, frankly, it's because of weddings and lace and stuff like that, that they really want to reduce the moire issues, and weddings are a big deal for the 5D Mark IV, so that's why they keep the low-pass filter in there. It's fascinating to me, by the way, thank you, Canon, for doing this, that the touchscreen is effective in all the menus. Yay! Thank you. That's a big plus for me. I'm really excited about the touchscreen. Have you guys used one yet that has a touchscreen in it?
Not a Canon camera.
My 1DX Mark II does.
But that only does that in live view and
oh yeah,
mode,
I'm not selecting. It would take way too long, in my opinion, to select everything. I I've gotten good with the twirly wheels and stuff. I can get through that menu pretty.
Wait until you try it, Barry. You will be a convert, I swear.
I can't wait till you send me your camera to test out. I'm going to do all kinds of fun stuff with it. So I'm there, man. I'm in.
As far as the Cine styles go, you guys mentioned that earlier. I was reading just to make sure I wasn't off my game. But you can install the profile onto pretty much any Canon camera. They try to tweak it per camera, so there isn't any reason why you couldn't install the current Cine style on a 5D Mark IV when it's released. However, it may not be as effective as it was for the previous generation of camera, depending on what they're doing with the sensor and so on. So if you guys like that style, I mean, it's still just a matter of opening up your Canon controller for your camera, plugging it in via USB, and then adding it to your custom presets.
I'll tell you one thing that's missing from this camera, which I really wish Canon would do, and that is allow you to save some settings onto a CF card or an SD card. You know, for an example, let's say you're going to go do a shoot and you're going to have 3 cameras, assuming they're all 5D Mark IVs. Wouldn't it be nice to be able to set all the settings on one and just put it on a card and be able to take that card to the other 2 or 3 cameras and say, load those settings so they all match exactly when you get ready to start?
Would be nice.
I think that's a great idea. I've mentioned that to Canon multiple times, and they haven't implemented it yet, so I'm going to keep mentioning it until they do.
There might be an issue with that, though, Mitch. If they open up the metadata for the camera in such a way that it's just dumped out onto the memory card, I assume it would run into the same issue where you'd have a .xml file, and that may open up settings and controls that they would try to probably cover up or hide from regular users.
Oh, no.
Or it would also open the door to someone just using a text editor to go in and dink around with it and possibly brick their camera if they're
that's a good point.
Not smart about it. And I mean, come on, how many people have opened up some HTML and messed around with it and caused havoc on a website? Okay, maybe I'm the only one.
No, you're the only one. That's right. If you cannot shoot in HDR, that will be a bummer. HDR still exists in stills, Stephen, if that's the question.
Now, what about the recording limit, guys? Are either one of you upset about the continued European embargo on 29 minutes and 59 seconds?
Yes.
Barry, you are muted.
Barry's muted.
I'm muted. So I was going to say I never expected them to get rid of it, so I guess I'm not disappointed because I never expected that to change.
How often do you shoot more than 30 minutes, DJ?
Regularly for conferences or public addresses, or I shouldn't say it, but I'm going to say it. When CEOs are addressing the minions and they need to give a long speech about the state of the company, generally those will go 30 or 40 minutes, and one of the prime uses for my GH4 is actually for shooting things that are longer than 29 minutes and 59 seconds.
How come nobody's ever sued them in the European Union for breaking that limit? How is that, and why doesn't anybody else go along with it?
I think it's a farce. In general, they have it as a rule and people follow it, but there's many companies that don't adhere to it, and no repercussions have come about because of it. However, you are leaving yourself open, so maybe if they see a big enough dollar sign in the future for suing you or doing whatever the European can do to sanction you, taxes-wise, then maybe that's enough, I guess. I don't know. If Panasonic's fairly large, but pretty small compared to Sony and Canon, so maybe that would be the reason they just don't think it's going to happen.
I'm going to answer Jeff's question. Jeff has a long-winded question. He currently owns the 20D and wants the Mark III, but can't afford it. Should he dump the 20D and move on? I'm going to use Barry's answer. If it's still working for you and you're making money with it, stick with it. What do you guys think?
Well, since I said that, then I'm going to agree with myself.
The camera you have is the camera you use, and if you're using it and you don't have any problems with it, I mean, don't fall into my shoes and continually upgrade every year. And I mean, I do amortize my cameras so they all make money for me, but at the same time, I'm often jonesing for the next generation of cameras. And somebody brought up the C500 in the chat, and I started looking at prices, and now I'm like, wow, I could get a C500 for $6,000. That would be a great bargain. Why don't I do that? I might. Watch me purchase it.
If you want to send that to me, I'll test it out for you as well. And I'll give you a comparison between the 5D Mark IV and the C500.
Perfect.
Someone's got to do it.
How long will it take you to do that, Barry? 6 months or a year?
I'm going to say it's going to take me about 2 years. You'll get them back, and we'll do it with the next version. That sounds perfect.
One thing to note, guys, if you are looking for a C500, the PL version is selling for far cheaper than the EF version. So I guess if you have access to some PL mount lenses, there you go.
Or couldn't you get a Metabones adapter? Or do they not make a PL version?
I don't know, to be honest. I don't think they do. And even if they did, you'd still have to have... Yeah, well, you'd lose out on the electronics, I suppose.
So good news, by the way, some good things. The same battery as the 5D Mark III, but you do need a new external battery grip if you like those. The weather sealing is improved over the 5D Mark III. We have Wi-Fi and NFC. So you guys ever transfer files via Wi-Fi?
Yes.
Do you?
Yeah, it's actually
that's a good feature.
It's fairly handy on the GH4. If I just shot something and I just need to send it off really quick, I can download it to my phone and send away. It's also great if you're just posting quick shots, still images or whatever. That's really nice. But the thing I didn't see about the Wi-Fi, and I'm interested to know, both Panasonic and Sony offer full video monitoring in Wi-Fi mode, but previous generations of Canon Wi-Fi have disabled that functionality for video, but not for stills. Do we know if that's still the case with the 5D Mark IV?
I think that's true, because I've seen people mention video transfer via Wi-Fi, but I haven't seen anybody say video monitoring.
And then do we know if this is 2.4 or 5 gigahertz?
That's another good question.
Because the 2.4 implementation from Canon has always been very laggy, whereas I've recently been playing around with a few cameras that have 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi enabled, and oh my gosh, quarter of a second lag max. It's beautiful.
Sort of like Google Hangouts, right? Your mouth goes and then they're... Never mind.
What about the f8 focusing capability? This, for longer lenses, especially with the teleconverter, is probably a boon for photographers at the very least.
So, explain that quickly, would you? So, because I don't know that a lot of people understand that.
So previously, the cross-point focus wasn't it limited to what, f4, I believe? Does that sound right?
Yeah, there were some that were f4 and I think that's where I get really confused about the definition of what's a cross point and what's just AF point. But
so one AF point uses there's two types. There's contrast and there's phase detect, and the cross type use both. But the old versions were not cross type on the outside, but the center focus points or a group of clustered center points were cross type. And they were limited to, I believe, f4 in many of the cameras. And because of that, if you had a teleconverter and a lens that was already an f4 lens, then you were past the minimum focus range, so the lens wouldn't focus correctly for you. But with f8, now you can put a teleconverter on there and still have an f4 lens on there and get focus from that cross type without issue. And I think the cross type is across the entire range now, as opposed to just a patch in the center. And if I remember correctly, it's f8 all the way across all of those and not just the center group.
You are correct. which is a big boon for those of you who needed to. I mean, I don't really often think about the fact that I couldn't use some of those side focus points because I tend to be center focus point, adjust and recompose and shoot. So
Steven posted a correction in the chat too. The 5D Mark IV, Mark III was limited. He says is limited to f8 at just the center.
Right.
Okay,
yeah.
so
I knew it. The B&H video this morning, they talked about this somewhat extensively and how this is a landmark change that none of the other cameras do anything close to this. So photographers should be jumping up and down. An interesting, well, not an interesting question.
I'll state this, and then we can kind of see what other things we haven't hit. But I think the people who complain the most about this camera are people that want to shoot video. And I still think video people for Canon are a rounding error. So it's the sort of thing where you have to take in a grain of salt that it's primarily servicing people who take still images. And so therefore, a lot of video people are like glaze over when you start talking about focus points and all this sort of stuff. They're like, I don't use that, and that's worthless. Like, nope, that's what drives the camera. The camera exists because people want to take pictures with it.
Yeah, those are the same people, Barry, that used to say, well, autofocus in video sucks. Why would anybody ever use it?
I don't know. I'm a lazy filmmaker. I use autofocus all the time. The A7S Mark II's autofocus system, I can just point it at something and forget about it, and it's almost perfect.
The thing that nobody bothered to tell me about autofocus is that somehow they would make it intelligent to track the person. Autofocus in the past would just kind of look for what's moving, and it would just randomly do what it does. So they've improved autofocus. So then, yes, if it doesn't screw up your shot, it's helpful. But by and large, I still love, even though I can have 7 or 10 different speeds, it's just like the difference between a gimbal and a Steadicam. A gimbal, there's mechanics. In a Steadicam, there's human breath, there's human motion behind it. And when you're actually pulling focus on the lens, you can do it and create kind of an art to it where mechanics don't have the art. So I still think if you're creating art, do it properly. But a lot of times we're just getting paid, and having something quick and dirty is preferable as well. So this camera will do both.
I wish I could say I do art all the time, but instead, most of the time, I am a crummy filmmaker when it comes to caring about the art, and I just poop out as much stuff as I can.
Yeah.
Are there features that we haven't hit on? I want to make sure that we don't go forever and that we're actually hitting all the things that people want to know about. I think we've addressed all the questions there.
Let's talk about the memory cards, guys. Have you either one of you disappointed that CF and SD card slot as opposed to upgrading to CFast or one of the other faster components? And what does this mean for 4K shooting? Because a 500 megabit Kodak, you're going to have still top end cards. And 128 gigs, 25-ish minutes, 30 minutes, so 256 gig cards. Are we going to start seeing 512 gig cards that people need for this camera to shoot a longer duration?
Either way they would lose. If they upgraded to CF fast cards, they're outrageously expensive, and then people would be complaining. And because it's already dumbed down 4K video, people would say, well, I don't need it, and so they lose. Now, if they don't have it, then we're complaining because, oh, we don't get as much on the cards and stuff. And I think what they did is they didn't want to rock the boat and do what Apple does every time they launch things. Like, here's a camera, wow, buy all the accessories. And so they just wanted to make it as painless as possible for people to buy and keep shooting. And I think they made the right choice.
I think Barry, you echo what I've been thinking and what I heard on the B&H chat earlier this morning. The fact that there's the same battery, the only difference is like the grip, the fact that the card slots are still the same. This is an incremental, although significant incremental upgrade. It's not a revolution. The dual pixel RAW, which by the way, Craig, we kind of covered earlier, so I'm not going to go back through that. I'm sorry if you missed it. It's a significant improvement, but it's not it's not like Vincent LaFerré is going to come jumping up and down saying this is something revolutionary. It's not a game changer, to use that old worn out phrase. So yes, I'm a little disappointed that the cards aren't improved, but at the same time,
No.
if they can record 4K motion JPEG at 500 megabits per second on a decent fast card, then I don't need anything else, do I, really?
None of us need this stuff. That's the great part. We don't need any of this. We just need to figure out what we need to make money.
Right.
That's what it comes down to.
And
Unless it's
by
a
the way,
passion. Like, if it's something that you don't need to make money at, great. If you're wealthy and you're retired and you get to just do whatever you want, then you can pick what you want. But
how do I do that? Can I sign up for that?
Yep. How old are you?
Only 30 more years to go.
Okay, you're fine. 45 years from now, you can do whatever the hell you want.
Yes.
And I think Canon's answer would be, by the way, let's talk about the CF cards and the fact that a couple of people are complaining that we only get 7 frames per second, which was 6 frames per second on the 5D Mark II or 3, and the buffers, you can't jam like 6,000 raw images out on the buffers. And Canon's response is, well, like Barry said, you're the 1% of people. Go buy a frickin' 1DX Mark II if that's what you need, because that's where they've put that kind of technology. If you're getting paid to do that kind of a job, go buy that camera and do what you need to do.
Correct.
It doesn't need to be in this camera.
So quit
whining.
I bought cameras for more than I wanted to get a feature set that I needed, and I just realized that I'd have to pay for that feature, and that's what people have to figure out.
Yeah. Steven says, I wonder what it'd be like to see what the battery does when shooting 4K. I suspect that it's not going to be much different, and if you go buy a Sony EOS2, you need 20 batteries in order to deal with 4K on that sucker.
Because they're this tiny, guys. They're this tiny. Look at this horrible battery.
So, yeah, there maybe it runs out 30 minutes faster than it would have before. But good golly, how long do you put a? I mean, I never change batteries. I take my 5D out and shoot all day with it and never need to change battery.
Are you shooting video though, or are you stills?
I'm doing combination of stills and video, and I'm not making a movie like you guys are, shorts or anything else. So, but in the and even then, it's not like shooting with the A7S where you need 12 batteries for a day.
Well, remember too, guys, that the readout for the screen on the back of your camera, it takes the same amount of energy to run the screen and the sensor and all the other bits as you're just looking at the live view mode. 4K isn't going to add much because they're not doing heavy compression, so you're not using a ton of CPU cycles. So power usage is going to be typical of a 5D Mark III, in my opinion. I don't see it going any worse than that, really. The camera is even using less of the sensor than it would normally. So if they were able to somehow disable the power usage of the rest of the sensor during that 1.73 crop, you could theoretically increase the battery life in 4K recording.
Good point. Very good point. So let's hit a couple of other things. Do you guys care that there is not C-Log on this camera?
I'd love it if it was there, but again, that's not what this camera is for, in my opinion.
What about zebras and focus peaking?
That would be nice, but I've taken less as I've moved along. I rely more on my monitor to have functionality, like putting on a LUT, focus assist, all that sort of stuff off my monitor than on the camera, because I'm jumping between cameras, and I like to be able to kind of keep one thing that I know how to use as opposed to learning every little nook and cranny. So if you have a monitor that will do that, I don't think it's a deal killer.
DJ, do you have any input?
No, I mirror that same.
Okay. What about the flippy dippy screen? Don't you wish it had that?
Yes.
No.
I knew I would get both answers out of you guys. Why don't you want one, Barry?
Because you don't look as cool as the client, if you can just flip it up and look, you have to get down on the ground and get dirty or wet, and they're like, wow, he's really hardcore, and then they pay you more. It's all about perception.
When I'm working in an area where there are machine metal shavings laying on the ground and oil from different mechanical processes, I love the fact that I can flip this up and aim it up and simply look down. And in fact, when I have my GH4 as my primary shooting item or my Sony A7S, I don't generally tend to bring a screen as much unless I'm doing manual focusing or I'm concerned about my focus in general. So I love flippy screens. I want them in every single camera I own, and not this ridiculous Sony flip out screen where it just goes up. I want to go in every direction, and maybe we can get it even wackier and allow us to go up and over the camera for any kind of application. But Canon will never do it for us in their primary cameras, I don't think.
I like unicorns. Unicorns are cool. So if we're just asking for stuff, we could ask for that.
Yeah, that'd be lovely. Nice unicorn on top of the camera.
Yeah.
Let's see. Hey, anything else in the specs? Oh, go ahead.
For those of you who are ordering, I just posted the B&H order link if you're interested in using my affiliate link and helping me feed my family in college tuition and stuff. Somebody asked, yes, it's the same battery. We've already talked about that, so you don't have to use different batteries. There is a new button, by the way. We haven't talked about the new button. Did you guys notice the new button?
No, what's it do?
It's right next to the Q on the back, and it's designed to be AF area selection, so autofocus area selection, but it's programmable. So you can program it to switch the ISO, and I think it's an interesting concept, and I'll have to try this out. But for example, you're in a room and it's gotten darker or something, and you program it for ISO. All you have to do is bump it, and it will go up by a third or a half stop, depending upon how you have it set. And so you can increase, say, the ISO, or maybe set it to the shutter speed, or change your autofocus selection. So you can make it, it's sort of like using the flippy wheel, but if you happen to constantly want to pick the second button on the top in order to change the ISO, and then you have to use the flippy wheel. So it's just a convenience issue. It was initially started on the A7, I'm sorry, the 7D Mark II, I believe, has that button on it, and it's now been extended to the 5D Mark IV.
Hey, Mitch?
Yes?
I might have to sign off. I have another thing to do here in a couple minutes, so is there anything else we want to cover before I have to sign off? I'm actually having a lot of fun and feeling bad.
You're feeling bad that you're having fun? Well, gosh.
No, fun that I have to leave the fun.
I'm just giving you grief because of the way you said it. So, all right, since we've covered almost all of the stuff that I can think of. I don't know that there have been any other questions that we haven't answered, but Barry, I think we know that you're happy with your 1DX Mark II. This probably isn't enough to make you jump ship and sell that. Is that what I've gathered?
If I did not need 60p and 4K, this camera would be fine for me. I have enough clients where I have to have that, which is why the 1DX Mark II I will stay with. But I'm back and forth. I'm going to put my hands on the camera, and I may sell my 5D3 and upgrade to the 4 based on a couple things I want to check out with. But I'm very happy with the release. This is definitely a camera I would recommend people buy.
Awesome. All right. If you need to bail out, that's good. I think DJ and I will finish answering questions if anybody has them.
And I'll say if anybody wants, I'll put it here. If you have questions, feel free to email me as well. I'm happy to answer questions for you after this as well. But I appreciate people spending some time here and learning about cool stuff, and hopefully we answered some of the questions you guys were hoping to.
Amen. And if you guys didn't chime in at the beginning. This is Barry's book, although it's in second edition. I don't have the second edition yet. This is the best book in the market if you want to learn how to use a DSLR for filmmaking. Buy it. I won't tell you what the link is, but it's planet5d.com/Barry. Plug.
All right, well,
Thanks,
you
Barry.
guys have fun. We'll
Thanks,
talk
Barry.
to you soon. Pleasure.
So my preference is, in terms of this upgrade, do I have to have it for my job, what I do for Planet 5D? I think the answer is yes. Planet 5D has typically been, knowing everything there is about sort of all the Canon cameras. Do I really, 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 really have to have it? The answer is probably no, but I'm lusting after this thing a lot. And my plan is, I currently have 3 bodies. I have a 5D Mark III, a 5D Mark II, which I held on to purely for the fact of doing comparisons, like I was talking about before.
Yeah.
And I also bought a T4i back when that first launched. And because I liked the flippy dippy screen, and I like to be able to have that turns backwards so that when I'm doing solo video for Planet 5D reviews or whatever, I can see what I'm shooting and not have to put a big old extra monitor on. I could just use a tripod and a microphone and run with it. So do I have to have it? No. What I'll probably do is I am going to buy the 5D Mark IV. I'm going to probably sell my 5D Mark III and my 5D Mark II and just keep the T4i. But then again, my daughter, she's been shooting some photos recently, and I initially was giving her the T4i to go shoot. She shoots some portraits of friends and stuff at college, and I gave her the 5D Mark II, and she was like, "Dad, why is that so much better than the images that I get off of the T4i?" I'm like, "Well, it's full frame, and it has better focusing, and it's a more expensive camera, and blah, 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 blah." And so every time after that, she's taken the 5D Mark II out, and the T4i sits gathering dust. So maybe I need to keep one of those. I mean, if you're doing any kind of work, it's great to have a backup camera, so I probably need at least 2 bodies. DJ has 12 or 13 different bodies, so that's a whole nother story for him, but he's constantly rotating cameras. So is this lusty enough for DJ to buy?
So here's the deal, Mitch. I was holding out on a Canon purchase until I saw the 5D Mark IV and saw the specs. And my first thing before I even thought about it is I pre-ordered it. But now that I've talked about the specs, looked at the 1DC and some of the other cameras that are available in Canon's lineup, I may spend an extra $500 and just get a 1DC instead of the 5D Mark IV. And as a filmmaker, it probably makes more sense for me than it feels like the 5D Mark IV is a little bit more stills focused than video focused.
But the 1DC doesn't have the dual pixel autofocus on it, right?
I think I can live without that.
Do you? Okay.
Yeah, I do. When I say I'm a lazy filmmaker and autofocus is something I use, what I generally do is when I'm composing my shots, as opposed to pulling focus to get it in focus, I half press the button and get my subject into focus and then frame and start filming. And even that, I generally use the center as my focus point. So I, half press, frame, and then I'm done and I film. And that's good enough for me for most things. I do like the idea of being able to touch the screen to pull focus between points. But you know what? For the crop factor, I think I'd rather have 1DC.
I see. Good.
You sound down about that, Mitch.
No. It's and Jeff just asked, is there a reason to buy the Mark III because of the price drop, or is the 4 that superior of a camera over the 3? And I would say right now it's difficult to say because none of us have had our hands on the camera.
Yeah.
The people that I've listened to today and talked to seem to indicate that it's a pretty significant improvement if you do a lot of stills. Again, the video is a bump in increment if you're primarily shooting video. maybe the 1DC or the 1DX Mark II or Sony A7S Mark II or whatever is maybe a better choice. I think this is a significant improvement. I'm excited about it because I want to try out the dual pixel RAW and maybe the time-lapse movie mode, which we didn't talk about, which is, kind of a nit. The GPS we didn't even mention, but it depends upon what your needs are. I mean, I can give my answer, Jeff, and DJ can give his answer, and it may be different, but we don't know what your shooting style is, what your primary
or what
needs
camera you're
are.
working with right now. I mean, if you have a really, really old camera, any camera may be an improvement over what you're currently shooting on. And I'm looking at the used prices, $1,400 for a 5D Mark III right now, or less.
Don't say that. I want to sell mine.
Yeah, I'm so glad I got rid of both of my 5D Mark IIIs about 2.5 months ago when they were worth $2,200 a pop. So yep. You've effectively lost $600 or $700 in value. I think the 5D Mark III, if you're shooting stills, unless you need 30 megapixels, still a great camera and very awesome for photographers as far as video and film projects. I mean, how many people need 4K? If you don't need 4K, is it really worth it?
Yeah.
$1,600 difference in price buys you a lot of lenses.
Amen.
And lenses are more important.
That's a very, very, very valid point, especially if you don't have lots of lenses. And something to remember, speaking of that, is that this is a jump in 10 megapixels in terms of still images. If you're going to shoot photos, you can buy the 5D Mark IV and use a $200 lens and be totally pissed off because if that lens doesn't have the resolving power to match that 30 megapixel image, you're going to look at it and you're going to, damn, this is soft. This is crappy. So an investment in high quality lenses is probably more important than the fancy ass bells and whistles that you may or may not ever use. Heck, go buy a 5D Mark II and spend the money on lenses.
Although I will say, as in the photography department, the AF in the 5D Mark III is a lovely, 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 lovely improvement over the 5D Mark II.
Very valid point.
And so, you read all these things and you listen to people talk about it. Apparently, that's the same level of improvement we're going to see in autofocus between the 5D Mark III and 5D Mark IV. As a person who hasn't touched the 5D Mark IV yet, maybe that's valid. Maybe it's so much more amazing than the 5D Mark III. But I think we'll have to wait and see how that pans out. Yeah,
very, very good point. By the way, for those of you who are still with us, thank you for watching. Before you go, I have popped up the offer button if you want to register to go see the Bruce Dorn live chat about 5D Mark IV, and we can certainly ask him some of these questions about how well it works for photo and video. And gosh, speaking of that, we didn't even mention the fact that you can take 4K stills out of the video at any point, which is a big selling feature for some people. But anyway, sign up for that. Will be Monday at 1 o'clock Eastern time. I'm going to have Bruce Dorn, who is a Canon Explorer Lite, and several people from his team. They shot a video with the 5D Mark IV, and so that offer should be up there if you want to click that button. Or just look on planet5d.com. We'll have that offer slathered all over the website. You can find it fairly easily. Can we talk about the 16 to 35 millimeter version 3, which was just announced?
How many more of these are they going to come out with?
For interior photography, a lot. The only thing I can tell you, Jeff, is, and I actually made a note in my notes today from the B&H video that I saw this morning. The gentleman that was trying out the 1635 version 3, the words he said was, it was incredibly sharp and well worth the upgrade. Now, he was on a chat with B&H where they're trying to sell gear. So I maybe you can go back and rewatch that if you want to. It was about maybe 2/3 of the way through the conversation. But that's the only thing I can say about the 16 to 35 was that reference. I have not looked at any of the specs or anything else.
The reason I groan is because I purchased it seems like only, a year and a half, 2 years ago, I bought the 16 to 35 millimeter f2, and that was supposed to be the greatest lens ever. And now, like, lo and behold, a year and a half, 2 years later, they've kicked out another version. I remember when this was refreshed maybe once every 5 to 7 years, and now it's like I can't even turn around with my lens being outdated in my bag. Canon, you jerks.
Yeah. I understand. It's okay. Jeff, the answer, will the Bruce Dorn talk be recorded? Yes, just like this one is being recorded, hopefully, and will be up on YouTube. I believe that's where it goes. Steven's asking about the dynamic range. The 5DS gives you 50 megapixels, but less dynamic range and more noise. Again, I can't speak to it directly. I do know the guys on the B&H video, and I'm glad I watched that because it had a lot of information in it, and I thought it was very interesting. And I've tried to portray much of that here too. The guys that have shot with the 5D Mark IV say that the ISO has the higher ISOs because the camera now goes to 32,000 at the unextended range. Is very noiseless. Now, we still haven't seen samples of that yet, but I will tell you, when I had my hands on the 1DX Mark II, and I wish Barry was still here to answer this, I only had a demo copy for about an hour, so I didn't actually get to save anything with it. But when I was looking at the 1DX Mark II, the noise at the 40,000 and 60,000, whatever the right ISO numbers, was virtually non-existent. And the gentleman on the B&H call today were talking about this sensor. The image quality was phenomenal, and it was very low noise in the higher ISOs. Again, I don't have any samples to prove that yet. We'll have to wait and see, but that's something I'm certainly going to be looking at when I get my camera in about 2 weeks, which is the other thing that's rather phenomenal. Is Canon is supposedly going to have this out by September 8th, which is 2 weeks from today. So we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, that's a very fast turnaround from announcement. Normally we wait several months for...
Yeah.
Which is nice. But I wondered too, Photokina is on its way. Do you think Canon's expecting a bunch of other cameras to be released at that time, and they're trying to preemptively strike by getting this camera out as fast as possible?
You mean by other manufacturers?
Yes.
Yeah, well, of course, that's quite possible, and it would be a good strategy. I've always complained to them every time I get the chance. We have an ongoing conversation, I should say, about Canon Rumors, because Craig, who runs Canon Rumors, is a good friend of mine, and every time I talk to them about Canon Rumors, they say, well, Canon Rumors publishes the specs and they kill our sales on the other cameras, like the 5D Mark III sales drop when Canon Rumor publishes the 5D Mark IV specs, and we really hate that. And I always say to them, you guys have the worst double standard in that regard, because they announce, when they announced the 1DX, I remember I was on the NDA for the 1DX, and the announcement was like 3 months before it was actually going to be shipping. And I said, you guys are killing your own sales of the 1D by announcing it and not releasing it for 3 months. I mean, how can you blame Canon Rumors for that and the other rumor websites when you're doing it to yourself? If you want to kill that problem, then do this. Announce a camera, and 2 weeks later or 3 weeks later or whatever, ship the dadgum thing. I've made my point. So
Yeah,
anyway,
you're absolutely right. It's good that they're shipping it fast. The announcement comes out. We have the camera next. That makes people excited and buy the camera immediately, and it does the job of not undercutting your sales all the way up to the very end when they announce the new camera and then get it into your hands.
Yeah.
And it's not just an announcement. It was an announcement and a pre-order. So a lot of times the announcement comes, and then it'll be several weeks before you can start pre-ordering. You're waiting with bated breath to see the next thing that comes, and you don't get a chance to actually click the buy button. And they need to sell it to you when you're excited, when you really want the camera. And I mean, I'm no exception. I immediately clicked buy as soon as I saw it. I was like, I want to make sure I'm on the first on this list. And now I'm looking at used 1DCs and thinking, holy crap, I could swing one of these for $3,000. Maybe that will be the way I go. I don't know yet.
Yeah. Well. All right. So thank you. I think we're going to wrap this up at this point. It's been just a little over an hour and a half. I think that's plenty long for this particular conversation.
Absolutely.
Again, the 5D Mark IV conversation with Bruce Dorn and his team is Monday at 1 o'clock Eastern Time. I would love to have you tune in for that. We're going to record it if you can't make it at that particular time. DJ, thank you so much for showing up. And for those of you who are watching, DSLR Film Noob podcast is recorded on Fridays and Sundays, so twice a week, as long as everybody can make it. So tune into that. We always have a lot of fun. If you enjoyed this is pretty much what the podcast is like. We'll have certain conversations to have tomorrow about all kinds of different stuff, like lots of new lenses, I'm sure.
Oh, man.
Right, DJ? I didn't even publish the new Canon lens stuff. I mean, there's the new 24-105, and there's the 16-35.
Yeah, Canon already redoing so many lenses that have already been done. I just we'll talk about it. You want to do the show in the morning, Mitch? You still up for it?
Yeah, sure. Let's talk about that tomorrow.
All right, we will save that discussion for tomorrow. Thanks, Mitch, for having me. And as always, guys, thanks for tuning in.
Thank you very much, folks. This is Planet Mitch from Planet 5D. Over and out.